The Congo has had a legend of some sort of a large dinosaur-like creature forever, to the
Mm.
point where explorers have made their way into the Congo to try to find this thing.
In the heart of Central Africa, deep within the Republic of the Congo, lies one of the most mysterious places left on Earth, the vast Likuala Swamp. Covering nearly 55,000 square miles, this flooded rainforest is a world of black waters, endless channels, and dense jungle where sunlight struggles to reach the forest floor. The region is shaped by the winding Likuala aux Herbes River and countless hidden waterways that disappear beneath a ceiling of vegetation so thick that even today, large parts of this basin remain extremely difficult to explore. Despite satellites, GPS mapping, and modern aerial surveys, the Likuala Basin continues to hold secrets. It is a place where the wilderness is not just vast, it is protective, hiding whatever moves through its dark waters and flooded forests. Before we go any further, please subscribe to our channel and help us reach our goal of 5,000 subscribers. For more than 2 centuries, this isolated region has been at the center of one of the world's most enduring mysteries. As early as the late 1700s, French missionaries traveling through the Congo Basin recorded local stories about a gigantic creature said to inhabit the deepest waterways. Throughout the 1800s and into the 20th century, explorers, missionaries, naturalists, and scientific expeditions returned to the same rivers, hearing remarkably similar descriptions from villages separated by hundreds of miles and speaking entirely different languages. What makes this story extraordinary is not simply the legend itself, but the consistency of the accounts. Across generations, the witnesses have described the same enormous animal living deep within the black waters of the Likuala Swamp. Whether it is an undiscovered species, a centuries-old misunderstanding, or one of the greatest unsolved wildlife mysteries ever documented, the evidence has continued to draw researchers back to the Congo Basin for more than 200 years. And that is exactly where our investigation begins. For the researchers who followed these stories into the Congo Basin, the most unsettling part was not the idea of a mysterious creature hiding in a remote swamp. Unexplored places are expected to contain surprises. The difficult question was why the same surprise kept appearing in the words of people separated by enormous distances, different languages, and generations of time. By the early 20th century, reports of Mokele-Mbembe had begun reaching a wider audience. In the years after European explorers pushed deeper into Central Africa, stories from the remote rivers of the Congo Basin started appearing in travel accounts and expedition notes. At first, many outsiders treated these accounts as another example of unfamiliar wildlife being misunderstood by foreign observers. Africa was still revealing species unknown to Western science, and the idea of a large hidden animal did not seem completely impossible. But then came the details that changed the way some researchers viewed the mystery. The descriptions were not becoming larger with each retelling. They were becoming more specific. In the flooded forests near the Likuala aux Herbes River, local hunters and fishermen did not describe a magical creature from folklore. They described an animal with habits. They described where it moved, where it rested, what plants it fed on, and which parts of the river it avoided. They knew the difference between the animals they hunted and the animal they feared. To them, the mystery was not whether Mokele-Mbembe existed. The mystery was why outsiders found it so difficult to accept that something so familiar to them could be unknown to the rest of the world. During the 1900s, as natural history and modern biology advanced, the legend attracted a new kind of attention. Researchers began asking a different question. Instead of asking, could a dinosaur still be alive? They asked, what real animal, if any, could have created a story like this? That question would send multiple expeditions into one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The Congo Basin is not simply a forest. It is a living maze. Thousands of waterways divide the landscape into isolated regions, where a village only a few dozen miles away can be separated by days of difficult travel. Seasonal floods transform the terrain constantly. A river channel that exists one year may become a shallow marsh the next. Dense vegetation blocks visibility, and many areas can only be reached by narrow wooden canoes pushed slowly through tangled waterways. For an expedition searching for evidence, this environment creates an almost impossible problem. The same conditions that make the swamp a perfect hiding place also make it a nightmare for discovery. A large animal could disappear into a network of channels, leaving behind nothing more than a disturbed patch of vegetation or footprints that vanish after the next rainfall. And yet, for every difficulty the swamp created, one thing kept researchers returning: the witnesses. The people living along these rivers were not describing an animal they had only heard about in stories. Many claimed they had seen it themselves, sometimes from a distance, sometimes while traveling through the waterways where they had spent their entire lives. Their accounts contained similarities that caught the attention of investigators. They described an animal that moved slowly through deep water, an animal that appeared calm unless approached too closely, an animal powerful enough to overturn a canoe, yet not interested in hunting humans, an animal that belonged to the river itself. To a scientist trained to search for patterns, those details were impossible to ignore. Because there was another strange element hidden inside these reports. The witnesses were not describing a creature designed to frighten outsiders. They were not adding supernatural abilities, impossible powers, or exaggerated features. They were describing something surprisingly ordinary: a large animal, a very large animal, a creature that behaved like wildlife. And that raised the most difficult question of all. If Mokele-Mbembe was real, what exactly could it be? The answer would require researchers to examine every possibility, from known African animals to ancient survivors from Earth's distant past. And the deeper they looked, the more complicated the mystery became. Because the creature drawn in the mud of the Likuala swamp was not just unfamiliar, it looked impossible. What is striking is what they returned with instead. They came back carrying stories, notes, drawings, interviews, measurements of footprints, accounts from people who had no reason to create a mystery for outsiders. Not proof in the scientific sense, but enough unanswered questions to keep the search alive. For some researchers, that was the most frustrating part of the entire investigation. Every expedition seemed to reach the same invisible wall. The evidence was always close enough to be interesting, but never close enough to be conclusive. A footprint would appear in the mud after heavy rains, only to disappear beneath the next flood. A distant movement would disturb the water, but by the time a boat reached the location, the channel would be empty. A witness would describe seeing the animal clearly, yet the thick vegetation and dark water would leave no physical trace behind. The swamp seemed to offer clues, and then immediately erase them. One of the biggest challenges for investigators was separating what could be explained from what remained uncertain. The Congo Basin was already home to some of Africa's most impressive animals. Forest elephants moved silently through flooded regions. Hippopotamuses traveled through waterways at night. Massive crocodiles could remain almost completely hidden beneath the surface. Any one of these creatures, seen under the wrong conditions, could create a frightening encounter. But the descriptions collected from local communities continued to present the same problem. They were not describing a familiar animal seen from a strange angle. They were describing something with a completely different shape. A long neck rising above the water. A massive body moving slowly through flooded forests. A small head held high above the surface. A creature that behaved less like a predator and more like a giant herbivore, protecting its territory. And that detail fascinated some researchers more than the size itself. Because if people were inventing a monster, they would likely create something terrifying. They would describe sharp teeth, aggression, attacks, and danger. But the creature described in the Likawala swamp was almost the opposite. It was quiet. It was cautious. It was described as an animal that wanted to avoid humans. That made the mystery even stranger. Throughout the 20th century, several explorers entered the Congo Basin specifically because of these reports. Some arrived hoping to prove the stories false. Others arrived simply wanting to understand why the same account had survived for so long. But almost every expedition faced the same reality within days of entering the swamp. The environment itself was the greatest obstacle. The Likawala Basin is not a place where you simply walk into the forest and search. It is a constantly changing world of water. Rivers expand and disappear with the seasons. Thick vegetation blocks visibility. The sounds of insects, birds, and moving water create a constant wall of noise. Navigation can become impossible only a few miles away from a known route. For an unknown animal to remain hidden, there would not require magic. It would require only the right environment. And the Likawala may be one of the few places on Earth that provides exactly that. But the question remained. Could a large unknown animal truly survive in this region for centuries without leaving undeniable evidence? That was where the debate became more complicated. Biologists pointed out that a breeding population of enormous animals would normally leave signs behind. Tracks would appear more often. Remains would eventually be discovered. Feeding patterns would become visible. Modern technology would likely detect some evidence. The swamp could hide an individual animal. But hiding an entire population for generations was a much greater challenge. This became the central conflict surrounding Mokele-Mbembe. The witnesses were consistent. The environment was capable of hiding secrets. The descriptions were strangely specific. But the physical evidence remained missing. And this was the point where the mystery moved away from simple exploration and into something much deeper. A battle between what people believed they had seen and what science requires before accepting that something exists. Because the most important question was no longer whether people believed in Mokele-Mbembe. The question was whether the world had overlooked a creature that had been hiding in plain sight for hundreds of years. And to answer that, researchers had to begin with the hardest task of all. They had to challenge every possible explanation one by one. But once again, the crocodile begins to fall apart when the details are examined closely. Because the crocodile is not an unknown creature in the Congo Basin, it is one of the oldest and most familiar dangers in the region. The people who live beside these rivers do not encounter crocodiles as distant mysteries. They know them intimately. They know how they move, how they hunt, how they disappear beneath the surface, and how quickly a calm stretch of water can become dangerous. A crocodile leaves a certain signature. The drag marks along the riverbank, the movement of a low body cutting through shallow water, the sudden silence among animals nearby, the shape of a head breaking the surface. These are not mysteries to experienced river communities. But the creature described in the Mokele-Mbembe accounts behaves differently. It does not wait beneath the surface like a predator. It does not strike from ambush. It does not feed on fish or large animals. Instead, witnesses repeatedly describe something that spends much of its time feeding on vegetation along the edges of the waterways. That detail may seem ordinary, but it is one of the reasons researchers found the account so unusual. The animal was not described as a monster. It was described as wildlife. A massive, quiet, plant-eating animal that moved through the swamp with the slow confidence of something that had nothing to fear. And that created another problem for anyone trying to explain the legend away. The shape was wrong. The behavior was wrong. The entire identity of the animal seemed wrong. A crocodile has a long body but not a long neck. It has powerful jaws but not the small head described by witnesses. It crawls low against the ground, while the creature in these accounts stood higher, supported by 4 thick legs that left deep impressions in the mud. The crocodile could explain a frightening encounter in dark water. It could explain a shadow moving beneath the surface, but it could not explain why generations of people kept drawing the same impossible shape. And this is where the mystery entered its most difficult stage. Because after removing the obvious candidates, the rhinoceros, the crocodile, the elephant, the hippopotamus, the investigators were left facing an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the problem was not identifying the wrong animal. Maybe the problem was that they were searching for an animal science had never officially recorded. But before accepting that conclusion, researchers had to confront the strongest argument against Mokele-Mbembe: the human mind itself. Throughout history, people have mistaken ordinary objects for extraordinary things. A floating log becomes a strange creature. A distant animal becomes something unknown. A shape hidden by darkness becomes something far larger in the imagination. And in a place where stories of a mysterious river creature have existed for generations, expectation can influence perception. A person who grows up hearing about a creature may be more likely to interpret an unusual sight as that creature. This explanation is powerful, it is reasonable, and in many cases it is correct. But it creates another question. Why do the descriptions remain so consistent? Why do different communities, separated by hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, continue describing the same features? The long neck, the heavy body, the aquatic lifestyle, the plant-based diet, the quiet behavior. If these were simply mistaken observations, researchers would expect the details to change. One village would describe a giant snake. Another would describe a strange elephant. Another would describe a massive crocodile. But that is not what happened. The mystery remained focused around the same image. And that is what kept bringing explorers back into the Congo Basin. Not the possibility of finding a dinosaur, not the desire to prove a legend true, but the scientific curiosity surrounding a pattern that refused to disappear. Because every investigation eventually reached the same point. The stories were too consistent to ignore. The environment was too vast to easily dismiss. But the physical evidence was still missing. No skeleton, no confirmed photograph, no captured specimen. Only the accounts of the people who lived closest to the mystery. And that left researchers with the hardest question of all. How much evidence is enough when the only witnesses are the people who know the landscape better than anyone else? To answer that, they had to look beyond the legend itself and examine what the swamp could realistically hide. Because if an unknown animal truly lived in the deepest regions of the Congo Basin, the environment would not just be its home. It would be its greatest defense. The crocodile remains one of the strongest explanations for anyone approaching the Mokele-Mbembe mystery from the outside. It is real. It is enormous. It lives in the same waterways. And under the right conditions, even a familiar animal can become something frightening. But the problem is that the people telling these stories are not outsiders looking at the Congo River for the first time. They are experts in their own environment. For generations, the communities of the Congo Basin have lived alongside crocodiles. They know the difference between a crocodile's movement and the movement of something else. They understand the danger of the animal because they have experienced it directly. A crocodile is not a mystery to them. It is part of daily life. They know the warning signs. They know the places where crocodiles wait. They know the sounds they make when they move through the water. They know the damage they leave behind. And that is exactly why their descriptions of Mokele-Mbembe stand out. They do not describe it as another crocodile hidden in the darkness. They describe it as something separate, something that belongs to a different category entirely. In some accounts, elders have even described the creature as an animal that crocodiles avoid, a powerful presence that dominates certain deep pools and channels where other dangerous animals do not enter. Whether those accounts represent a real biological relationship or simply the way local communities understand the creature, the distinction remains important. The details do not match. A crocodile has a long body, but it does not have a long, upright neck. A crocodile moves close to the water's surface, but the creature described by witnesses is often said to raise its head high above the river. A crocodile is a predator, while Mokele-Mbembe is repeatedly described as a plant eater, feeding on vegetation along the riverbanks and stripping leaves from specific plants. The anatomy is different. The behavior is different. The entire image is different. The crocodile can explain a frightening shadow in the water. It can explain a sudden movement in the reeds. But it cannot explain why generations of witnesses continue describing the same impossible silhouette. So the second explanation begins to weaken. The next possibility is far more complicated, because perhaps the mystery is not hiding in the water at all. Perhaps it is hiding inside the human mind. Misperception has always shaped stories of strange creatures. Throughout history, people have mistaken ordinary things for extraordinary ones. A distant shape becomes something unknown. A floating object becomes a creature. A familiar animal seen under unusual conditions becomes something impossible. And in a place where stories of Mokele-Mbembe have existed for generations, expectations could influence what people believe they see. A person who grows up hearing about a mysterious creature may naturally interpret an unclear sighting through that story. This is not a foolish explanation. It is one of the most important ideas in science. Human perception is powerful, but it is not perfect. The brain does not simply record the world like a camera. It fills gaps. It searches for patterns. It uses memories and expectations to interpret incomplete information. A log moving through dark water could become an animal. A swimming elephant seen from a distance could become something enormous and unfamiliar. A shadow beneath the surface could become a creature from legend. If every account of Mokele-Mbembe came from people who already believed in the creature, this explanation would be much stronger. But that is where the mystery becomes more difficult, because not every witness was expecting to see Mokele-Mbembe. Some explorers entered the region unfamiliar with the stories. Some researchers arrived hoping to find ordinary explanations. Some were actively looking for reasons to dismiss the legend. Yet again and again they encountered the same descriptions. Different villages, different languages, different generations. The same basic animal. The long neck, the heavy body, the connection to deep water, the plant-eating behavior, the unusual combination of features that did not fit any known African species. Misperception can create strange encounters. But misperception usually creates variation. One person sees a snake, another sees a crocodile, another sees a strange log. 100 confused observers usually produce 100 different explanations. But when independent groups continue describing the same shape, the question becomes more complicated. the mystery is no longer simply about what someone saw. It becomes about why so many people seem to describe the same thing. And this is where the investigation reaches its most uncomfortable point. Because after examining the obvious explanations, something remains. The rhinoceros fails because the witnesses know what a rhinoceros looks like. The crocodile fails because the anatomy and behavior do not match. Misperception fails because it does not fully explain the consistency across isolated communities. What remains is not proof of a prehistoric survivor. It is something much more uncertain. An unknown animal, a large aquatic creature living in one of the most inaccessible ecosystems on Earth, a place where thick forests, endless waterways, and limited human access could theoretically allow undiscovered species to survive. But there is a crucial difference between something being possible and something being proven. And that difference is where the entire mystery rests. Because after more than 2 centuries of stories, investigations, and expeditions, the world still has one unanswered question. If Mokele-Mbembe is real, where is the evidence that should have been left behind? No confirmed skeleton, no verified remains, no scientific specimen. Only the accounts of those who say they have seen something hidden in the deepest waters of Central Africa. And that is the point where the legend becomes both fascinating and frustrating, because the witnesses refuse to disappear, but the proof refuses to appear. Because in the end, every great mystery reaches the same unavoidable point. The moment where the stories stop, the speculation fades, and the only thing left is the evidence. And with Mokele-Mbembe, that evidence remains frustratingly incomplete. The accounts are numerous. The descriptions are surprisingly consistent. The environment is perfectly suited for hiding something unknown. But science does not build conclusions from possibility alone. It needs something physical, something that can be examined, something that can be measured. A bone buried in the mud of the Congo Basin, a biological sample collected from the water, a clear photograph showing unmistakable features, a living animal recorded by a team of researchers. Without that, the mystery remains exactly what it has always been. A compelling case built on human experience, but without the final piece that transforms a story into a discovery. And perhaps that is why Mokele-Mbembe has survived for so long, because it exists in the space between 2 worlds. To some, it represents one of the greatest possibilities in modern exploration, the idea that somewhere, hidden in a remote corner of the planet, an unknown species could still be waiting to be found.